Wherever Izа Kремер sang, she was hailed as a genius. She mesmerized her audiences, entranced the critics, and caroused with the rich and famous.
There was one great singer of folk songs in America, and everybody knows that, was Izа Kремер.
A woman of courage who fought her own way to triumph against almost impossible odds, who saved her family from the bloody chaos of revolution.
She stood outside of so many cultures and watched them as they broke, and she survived them.
A woman of contradictions, who sang the songs of motherhood but left her daughter to be raised by others.
She was never with me at any important date of my life. Never once.
Izа Kремер sang what was forbidden. She sang for those who had no voices to sing themselves.
To a degree, my memories of her are my fantasy. A lot of them were formed when I was very young, so that, you know, we're seeing her through a prism, really. And I can't guarantee it's reality. This is just what I remember.
From the very beginning, she was attuned to the perfect melody. She would later say that as a child, it pained her to hear a single note sung off key. She herself began singing in her school choir, praising Jesus Christ in the rich, time-worn harmonies of Orthodox hymns. But Izа Kремер was not like the other school children. Izа was a Jew. Izа was born in 1887 in the town of Belz in the fertile vineyard country at the southern edge of the Russian Empire. Pretty as it was, Belz was also a kind of prison. It lay within the so-called Pale of Settlement, the small portion of Western Russia in which all Russian Jews were forced to live and do business. This world was the Yiddish world. Some 5 million Jews lived in the Pale. Although ancient Hebrew was the language of prayer and the Torah, the language of everyday Jewish life was Yiddish, a cousin of German, rich with proverbs and the stoic good humor bred through 1,000 years in the minority.
People lived daily a Jewish life. Our culture was created in Yiddish, the Yiddish literature, the Yiddish folklore. People were poor, and they find consolation in songs. It's something what is no way that I can to explain you, but it's inside, is this fire. What is Jewish, is a Jewish fire.
Yiddish was the language of the kitchen and the marketplace. That meant it was largely spoken and shaped by women. Izа first heard Yiddish folk songs in her cradle as her mother sang her to sleep. She was only 5 years old when she sneaked away from home to spy on a local wedding. That's when she heard klezmer music, the hypnotic, emotional music of Jewish weddings for the first time.
The music dragged me to it. As we got closer, we saw a huge crowd of Jewish men, women, and children. The men and women began to sing and beat the table with their knives and forks. and I joined along.
Because her father was well-to-do, Isa was allowed to attend the Orthodox Christian school. Her unique musical gift was forged between the wistful passions of Yiddish melodies and the soul-stirring hymns of the Orthodox Church. But Isa wanted to escape her pastoral prison. Her education would start her on her way. Even in the Pale, it was clear that change was in the air. In Russian and in Yiddish, radical writers were calling for the downfall of the Tsar and for the dawn of a new order. Teenage Izа Kремер added her voice to the growing chorus. At the age of 15, she sent revolutionary poems to the nearest big city newspaper, the liberal Odessa News. The paper's editor, 42-year-old Israel Heifetz, had surely seen his share of bad revolutionary poetry, but he thought Isa's verses were so good that he published them.
They were very revolutionary. There was, Citizens Arise. And they would start student demonstrations because young people at that point were already very disaffected. And they sort of used her poetry as a starting point. They would put it on placards, and they would walk through the streets chanting these poems.
Heifetz decided he would like to meet the young firebrand who was sending these poems from Belts.
And she and my grandmother came to Odessa, and he was flabbergasted. He had no idea of how young she was. And they had a talk, and he said, "What is it you really want to do with your life?" And she said, "I'm going to be a singer." In just those terms, not "I'd like to be a singer" or "I hope to be a singer." I'm going to be a singer.
Heifetz admired the ambition of his young country poet. He arranged for her to travel out of Russia to study opera in Milan with Professor Polione Ronzi.
For many, many Jews, the violin or the skill in the theater or the artistic skill was a way of getting out of the was a way of getting out of the Pale. And of course, for Izа Kремер, this certainly was the case.
Of course, it was unthinkable that she would go to Italy alone.
My grandmother was a real battle axe. She lived with my mother, left her husband and her son behind, which was unheard of in those days, and lived for those 2-3 years that Isa was studying, lived with her in Milan, which for a woman of her generation was astonishing.
As Russia began to shudder with the first tremors of revolution, Isa practiced her scales with Professor Ronzi and added Italian to her mastery of Russian and Yiddish. In 1902, she made her operatic debut as Mimi in La Bohème, playing opposite Tito Schipa. Isa returned home to Odessa in triumph. Her mentor and benefactor, Israel Heifetz, promptly proposed marriage.
It was a whim. It was a whim on his part. He was 27 years older than she. And, a man about town, very sophisticated. A bon vivant. And obviously, this was, as I said, a whim. They lived together, but not very seriously.
Educated, prominently married, and looking forward to a promising career, Isa had claimed a secure and rich future from the uncertainty of a villager's childhood. But that security was an illusion for Isa and for tens of millions of other Russians. In St. Petersburg, the storm was gathering, ready to sweep away the old Russia forever. On the eve of the Russian Revolution, Izа Kремер's adopted city of Odessa was a thriving crossroads of European culture. The street signs were printed in Russian, French, and Italian.
A colorful, boiling, marvelous city where all kinds of wit and all kinds of intellectual systems are developed. That's what Odessa means to anybody from Eastern Europe, and it makes no difference whether they're Russian or Jewish, it's the same.
The perfect place for a rising opera star like Isa. She toured in Madame Butterfly, in Manon, in Eugene Onegin, and The Tsar's Bride. But despite her success, she found the art of opera wanting.
She used to describe what was ridiculous to her about it, which was the hero is standing there in great danger, and he's about to be assassinated. And the chorus is saying, "They are coming, they are coming, they are coming, they are here." And he's standing there waiting to be knifed.
When she made her debut as Mimi in Bohème, it would crack her up because she was always, "I am dying, I am dying, I am dying, I am dead," you know. And she found it kind of hard to take it seriously.
Idiotic. You could never see the point of it. And she went into operetta.
Small, energetic, and handsome, she was an immediate success in operetta and was often cast in boys' parts. And theater was now a family business. Isa's brother, Manasseh, had moved from Belz to Odessa, where he started a vaudeville company. To help with the business, Manasseh hired a young gopher named Saul Hirok. In Odessa, Isa and her husband were moving in radical circles. Russia's intellectuals rejoiced in their belief that the Tsar's days were numbered. Still, so long as the Tsar remained in power, there were no more lavish patrons of the arts than the Romanovs. Isa traveled eagerly to perform in St. Petersburg and Moscow.
She became a favorite at the court. One of the stories that she told was that when she had made a debut in some operetta or concert or other, she received a huge bunch of flowers, roses, and inside the roses, two of the roses, were two enormous diamond earrings.
But Isa was discovering a passion for a different music altogether as she sang her operettas throughout a troubled Russia. Ethnic groups all over Russia were beginning to explore their folk roots. Folk songs, including Yiddish songs, were now being viewed as a legitimate art form. Then, at a concert, Isa was introduced to the beloved Jewish poet Chaim Bialik. As she told it, Bialik was blunt. "Why do you waste your time doing this? Anyone with a voice can sing classical music. Why don't you sing the songs of your own people?" According to Isa, her life changed on that night.
She did a great deal of traveling, and everywhere she traveled, she came back with folk songs.
She loved them so much, and she wanted to perform them in a concert style with an arrangement.
Word of mouth songs, largely. They were passed on from generation to generation. They were folk music.
Geweldige Schneiderjung, sollten wir Gassen haben. Nein, Mama, nein, mit der Schneiderjung, ihr seid.
And she decided that it had to be written down and codified in some way. So that's what she started doing. She started writing down the music.
For me, music must be genuine. It must simply and directly express an idea. It must be art for the great mass of people.
And so, Isa Kremer reinvented herself again. She decided to bring the true songs of real people to the same sophisticated audiences who had watched her sing opera and operetta. She quickly developed an unusual and enchanting style, transforming the simple, rough folk tunes into art songs, lieder.
Every song was a little play, and you saw the characters, you saw the transformation, and you understood the passion of the character.
No era una cantante que cantaba, sino era alguien que interpretaba, que hacía los personajes. Por ejemplo, cuando ella canta, Die Magetonen gehen Kinder, sich freien Stadt noch Stadt. En esa canción, ella hace personajes. Ella no canta toda la canción de la misma manera, sino que dice, ella lo representa inmediatamente. Con la voz uno se da cuenta que viene un señor gordo que entra a la fiesta.
Most Yiddish songs were songs of the home. That meant that they were usually about a woman's struggles in life. Courtship, marriage, children, family.
She brought out the emotions of women and of love and happiness and sadness. And it's the first time it was ever done in Yiddish music.
And Isa soon had first-hand experience with that happiness and sadness herself. In 1917, she and Heifetz had a daughter. They named her Tusia.
No, she never sang any of her songs to me. She was too busy talking.
Isa hired a wet nurse to feed Tusia. When it came time to tour and perform, she left Odessa once again. But the end was coming for Isa's charmed life on the Russian stage. In February 1917, after 3 disastrous years of the First World War, the Tsar abdicated the throne. The revolutionary dream of Isa's teenage poems had become a tenuous reality. Russia took its first teetering steps toward democracy. Isa and Heifetz cheered the new government and its leader, Alexander Kerensky, as the bright new hope for Russia. 8 months later, Kerensky was overthrown by Vladimir Lenin's Bolsheviks.
And when the Bolsheviks took over, of course, to them, the Kerensky people were anathema. They were, you know, people who were playing around with the revolution. They weren't serious. And that was when my father was jailed.
Israel Heifetz disappeared into a Bolshevik cell. The Red Army confiscated the family's house and banished Tusia and her uncle to the top floor. Odessa was placed under a strict curfew. Isa was not there. Touring when the Bolsheviks took over, she stayed away, settling in Constantinople just over the border from Russia. She waited to find a way of rescuing her family. And as she waited, she sang.
The Turks and the Greeks who lived in Constantinople loved her, and they would call out whenever she performed, Isa, sing Lama Zechiverbeten.
Isa would later say that before she left Constantinople, she sang more than 160 concerts, that she was so popular, the Sultan himself commanded a performance for the ladies of his harem.
When she was finished, the Sultan, who was very pleased with her concert, took this pin off his turban and he gave it to her. And it's uncut rubies, diamonds, and emeralds. And there's a little thing in here that holds the feather. You know, the mount of the feather is mounted on a pin, and there's this little opening right here where the feather went.
Only months later, the Sultan would be dethroned like the Tsar, and the harem disbanded. By the spring of 1921, Isa had been in exile in Constantinople for more than a year. One night, after a performance, a stranger approached Isa backstage. He told her he could smuggle her family out of Russia.
So she gave him a letter to my uncle and a piece of jewelry. And he came and spoke to my uncle and told him that he was an emissary for my mother and he was going to get us out. And then my nurse started prying the diamonds and the rubies and the emeralds out of jewelry and sewing them into my little padded jacket. And when they told us it was time to go, we all, in the dead of night, trooped downstairs and got into a hay wagon. My grandfather, my grandmother, my nurse and I. My uncle stayed behind to cover our departure. And that's how we got out of Russia.
They were reunited with Isa several months later in Sopot, Poland, near Gdansk. But Isa's husband, Israel, still remained in prison. Some of Isa and Israel's revolutionary compatriots had joined the ranks of the Bolsheviks, and it was with these old comrades that Isa now pleaded for the release of her husband. Israel Heifetz was freed from his Odessa cell and fled to Paris. The marriage, long a formality, was over.
And they never lived together again, except, you know, as visitors. They remained very good friends all their lives.
It was 1922. Isa settled her family in Warsaw and breathed deeply the free air of democratic Poland.
Poland was probably the only country in Europe that had the Jews were free to live basically everywhere and to perform many occupations where they were not allowed anywhere. Therefore, the numbers so much increased of Jews there because it was easier to live, I think, than anywhere else.
In the aftermath of the war, new political groups were springing up in Poland, including vocal anti-Semitic groups.
I remember her telling me that when her concerts were advertised in Warsaw, the day after her placards went up, there would be streamers pasted over the placards that said Żydówka, which is like kike.
As Isa prepared for concerts in Warsaw, her manager advised her to take her Yiddish songs off the program to avoid harassment. Reluctantly, she agreed and arranged instead to sing Yiddish at an invitation-only concert for an all-Jewish audience. But on the day of the Yiddish performance, right-wing students rioted, attacking anyone who tried to enter. The concert was canceled. It was the first time Isa had been ordered not to sing Jewish songs, and it was the last time she would obey such an order. The riot provided Isa with one of the essentials of a performer's life: publicity. Even in America, musical circles were buzzing with the Warsaw story. It was a perfect time for new bookings. 6 concerts in New York City, Carnegie Hall. In October 1922, only a year after she smuggled her family out of Russia, Iza Kремер made her American debut at Carnegie Hall. The concerts were a triumph. It was clear that much of the impression Isa made on her audiences was physical. Under the floodlight, wrote one critic, her eyes were black as night and glistening as 2 stars.
The secret of Madame Kremer's power, it seems to me, lies in the combination of rare physical charms and mental qualities, enhanced by a most fascinating personality.
It was, in fact, personality that distinguished Isa from other singers. Her singing voice in itself was strong, but what overwhelmed the listeners and the critics was her presence. Isa had star quality.
It was never overdone, it was never exaggerated, it was never cheap, it was style.
She had energy, passion, vitality, sensuality. You know, there's something so sensual in the music she chose, something difficult and complex and unpredictable.
And when she sang, "Geh ich will spazieren, tralalalala," this was wonderful. When the audience heard that, they went into applause and shouted hoorays.
Isa moved from city to city, charming critics and building a loyal audience. At the core of her following were American Jews. 4 million Jewish immigrants had arrived in America around the turn of the century. Those who attended Isa's performances were astounded to hear the songs of their parents delivered in the aristocratic concert halls.
She really brought the Yiddish folk song to the concert stage.
After touring America and adding English to her growing catalog of languages, Isa returned to Europe and moved to Berlin. In Rome and Paris, she mingled with the café culture and sipped wine with her favorite poets and radicals. She befriended Albert Einstein, rubbed elbows with Zionist leaders like Chaim Weizmann and Vladimir Jabotinsky, and musicians like Jascha Heifetz and Misha Elman. In 1926, Isa moved to New York. She bought a grand house near Brooklyn's Prospect Park and settled her aging parents and her daughter there. Her brother, Manasseh, soon moved to New York to join her.
He adored her. He never married. I'm sure he never married because she was the most important person in his life. He had lots of lady friends. It was quite notorious, but he never married. Well, he had me to take care of. He had to bring me up.
By the time Isa arrived in Brooklyn, her unusual combination of singing and acting had the critics falling over themselves to lavish praise on her. One transported writer pronounced Isa a radiant incarnation of artist's witchery. She looked and dressed the part.
Her clothes were so fantastic. They were just so absolutely gorgeous. She dressed at Chanel for her daytime clothes, and she had those wonderful pleated skirt jersey skirts with a jumper and a cardigan trimmed in the tricolor ribbon and the cloche hat. And then she had shoes, round-toed, high-heeled shoes with a strap across the instep, made in every color of all of these suits. She had one in lilac, she had one in turquoise, she had one in pink. They were really extraordinary.
She sang in Yiddish, in Russian, Italian, French, German, Polish, and English. She was considered not only brilliant and mysterious, but one of a kind.
Izа Kремер is beyond question one of the most gifted interpreters of song in the world.
Izа Kремер is a musical institution in this country. There is nobody like her, never has been, and never will be.
She was represented by her brother's one-time employee, Saul Hurok. Hurok had made himself a power in American entertainment, and he made Izа a star. In Los Angeles, she socialized with silver screen legends like Ernest Torrance. She began a 10-year love affair with Hurok's partner, George Salaha. And to her own amazement, she was invited to record some of her songs for Vitaphone, the grandfather of the music video.
Father was a Spanish merchant, and before he went to sea, he told me to be sure and answer no to all you say to me. No, sir, no, sir, no, sir, no, 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 sir, no, sir, no, sir, no. If when walking in the garden, plucking flowers.
Life for Izа turned into a cycle of concert tours, punctuated by parties, picnics, and brief visits to Brooklyn, where her daughter Tusia was growing up.
She was always absent. She would arrive. She was a visitation. I didn't have any expectations, really, of being with her. And I don't really remember resenting it. I remember having a fairly full life with a lot of friends and going to school and doing a lot of reading. And then when she would come, we'd have huge parties, and it would be very exciting. And she would always say to me, "You don't have to do that now. Don't study now. Come to the party."
In the summer, she toured Europe. In the winter, she toured the U.S. and Canada.
I used to always sit in the front row. So I used to see her peek out, you know, from the curtain, sort of peek out, you know, on the, to see what kind of an audience she had there. She always had a good audience.
Izа was bringing the powerful voice of Europe's Jews to the concert stage. And yet, despite her passion for the Yiddish world, she had little or no interest in the faith that had driven it. Izа was a secular Jew.
She was profoundly irreligious. She believed that religion was really the cause of all the dissent and all the difficulty in the world, and she thought that there shouldn't be any religion. But she was profoundly Jewish in her orientation to the world.
More Jewish, in a sense, than some of her loyal listeners. American Jews would flock to her concerts, but some would strongly suggest in private that she not sing in Yiddish. Izа ignored them.
There was an element in the community that determined with all its effort that it was going to become American, and that Yiddish was looked at as, you can see my humble origins. I came out of this poverty, out of this small shtetl, this persecuted environment, and now I'm breathing freer, and I don't want to be reminded of that, or anyone to identify me with what, that I was a slave?
In other parts of America, Yiddish was not so controversial. New York City's 2nd Avenue was lined with theaters featuring plays and musicals exclusively in Yiddish, many looking nostalgically back at the days in the old country. Izа had intentionally stepped over 2nd Avenue when she stormed the American concert stage. She was aiming for a broader audience.
She would not have wanted to be known as the Jewish singer. She wanted to be known as the international singer.
But 10 years later, Isa agreed to appear in one Yiddish musical. The show was to be called Song of the Ghetto. At its center was a heart-rending song of nostalgia for life in the Jewish Pale. The song was called Mein Städtele Belz. It was written for Izа Kремер, the star of the show, born and raised in Belz.
Belz, mein Städtele Belz, mein Heimele wie ich hab meine kindrische Jahre verbracht, sind ihr amul gewesen in Belz. But I tell you, I'd rather you buy a cassette or a record of it, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it very, very much.
Song of the Ghetto failed in the theater, and Isa left the 2nd Avenue Strip without regret. Mein Städtele Belz, on the other hand, would become possibly the most popular song ever created in the Yiddish theater.
I don't think she ever recorded it. Everybody else did, but I don't think she ever did. Well, she wouldn't have considered it a folk song. You know, she was a little purer than that in her choice of music.
In 1936, Isa returned to Berlin. It was a very different city from the one where she had lived only 10 years before. After Hitler came to power in 1933, the Nazi administration instructed all state institutions to fire their Jewish employees. Among the many Jews now out of work were hundreds of performing artists.
Several Jews got together in Berlin and decided that perhaps it would be possible to have a cultural organization which could hire the many Jews who are now jobless. And they got permission from the Nazis to found a cultural association run by Jews for Jews.
It was called the Jüdischer Kulturbund, the Jewish Cultural Alliance.
All the artists had to have that identification card with the picture and signature, swearing that they are 100% non-Aryans.
By the time Isa arrived to sing, the Kulturbund was the only place in Berlin that a Jewish singer could perform.
She arrived in Berlin and she went to the theater and she was asked for her program, and she gave them a program that had some Yiddish songs in it. And they said, that's impossible. You can't sing in Yiddish in Berlin now.
The German Jews who were not too crazy about Yiddish, you know, in fact, they hated the Yiddish together with the people who spoke it, the Ostjuden.
German Jews have a very complicated relationship to Yiddish. The deal of emancipation in the 19th century was that the German Jews would be allowed to become real political citizens if they gave up what the Germans thought of as their Jewish distinctiveness. They did adopt the German language, and so Yiddish was for them a sign of pre-emancipation status. And now that the Germans in the 30s were telling them they weren't German, it was very, I would guess, frightening for them to see a Yiddish actor on stage, because that was proving to the Germans who were sitting in the audience, the Gestapo, those were the only Germans who really came, that in fact, look, they are from a different nation, a different culture, a different race, and it might have been very frightening to them.
She said, that's my program, and either I sing with my Yiddish songs included, or I go.
The Berlin impresarios relented. Isa strode onto the stage. With Gestapo agents watching, she sang her folk songs, Russian, German, Italian, and Yiddish.
I remember exactly what she looked like, the gown she wore, a black lace. I see her in front of me, I can see her. I think she had a red flower in her hair, and the hair with the black hair, she looked so, and her flashing smile, I remember.
She was a fire point. She was a constant flame in the middle of the darkness, the growing darkness.
Over the next 9 years, 2/3 of Europe's Jews would be murdered on orders from Berlin. Russian, Polish, or German, in the approaching cataclysm, Jews would be Jews, no matter what language they spoke. By the late 1930s, the spread of fascism and anti-Semitism was making it dangerous for Jewish performers like Izа Kремер to tour in Europe. Fortunately, Isa's fame had already spread to a third continent. The European exiles of South America offered her a new market, and she was booked for concerts in Brazil and Argentina by a South American agent.
Mi padre traía de Estados Unidos los grandes cantantes como Izа Kремер. Cuando yo canto una canción, trato de interpretar lo que estoy haciendo, no cantando. Y eso indiscutiblemente me entró naturalmente viendo noche tras noche, porque yo iba a todos los conciertos de Isa.
It was on a 1934 trip to Argentina that Isa met psychiatrist Gregorio Berman. An active communist, he was already well known as an educational reformer and would later increase his fame by organizing a medical brigade for the Loyalists in the Spanish Civil War. Berman and his wife hosted Isa in their hometown of Cordoba.
November 3rd, 1934. My dear friends, I'll always remember how kindly you received me in Cordoba and your home, and it will be a pleasure to return the next time. Don't forget me. I have you in my heart. Your wild friend, Isa.
By the time Isa returned in 1938, Berman and his wife were separated. Wild friend Isa moved quickly into Gregorio's life.
No era que una extraña cayó en nuestra familia, sino que se había ido anudando un nuevo vínculo que nos parecía natural que mi padre tuviera otra pareja.
But as war in Europe became more and more certain, Isa traveled back and forth between the U.S. and Argentina, convinced that Berman's daughter disapproved of her and was trying to keep her out.
I cannot be with you because of that little egoist who permits herself to run two lives and two free people who love one another, as she will never know in her life. But she doesn't have to worry. I won't come anymore.
A veces había problemas. Algunas era, yo tengo la impresión de que ella hubiera preferido estar sola con papá y que mi presencia podía molestarlos.
Isa returned to New York, where her own daughter was engaged to be married. Tusia Heifetz married Kermit Pines on June 14, 1940. But Isa was not there. She had returned to Argentina to be with Gregorio. Tusia's father, 80-year-old Israel Heifetz, was not at the ceremony either. On the day of the wedding, he sent a telegram from Paris congratulating the newlyweds. Later on that same day, Paris fell to the Nazis.
We went to Maine on our honeymoon, and we tried to get news on the radio of what was going on. And we wired when we got home, and we wrote, of course, and got no news.
By moving to Argentina, Isa was in effect preparing for retirement. Isa was now 53 years old, and she knew that her greatest singing days were behind her. But she still had a following, and in South America, her fans were fiercely loyal.
Izа Kремер, around, I think it was between 12 till 12:30, she was singing. Radio Belgrano. And Thursday, it was no conversation. It was only one sound. Sha! Sha! Izа Kремер singt! Sha! Izа Kремер singt!
Argentina's intellectual life in those years was vibrant, in spite of the periodic repression. There was a vibrant artistic community, a vibrant literary community, and this was the kind of climate that I imagine that Isa found when she was there.
But Isa could no longer command regular audiences of a size that could sustain her earlier lavish lifestyle. Money was getting tight.
I mean, she didn't have any investments. She spent what she earned, and when she was in the flower of her career, making lots of money in those pre-tax days, don't forget. She was rich. She could do anything she wanted. And then, as she sang less and less, she made less and less money. And when she eventually was left with her jewelry. And every time she came to the United States, she sold something.
In between her stage appearances, Isa sang benefit concerts, usually for Jewish or leftist groups. Politics were once again part of daily life. Though it was decades since she had penned her revolutionary poems, she now inhabited the world of Gregorio Berman, a prominent leftist in a country where many people admired European fascists. Isa embraced Gregorio's struggle. She sang benefit concerts for striking workers. She became close friends with Berman's revolutionary colleagues, like the poet Rafael Alberti and his companion Maria Teresa Leon. And she celebrated every success of the Soviet army against the Germans. Isa had good reason to cheer for the Red Army. As Hitler's troops poured into Russia, they were cutting a savage swath through the shtetls of the Jewish Pale.
She had sort of a renaissance of political feeling when she married Gregorio, because he was a communist. But it was in a funny sort of way. I had a feeling that she was sort of floating above it all. You know, that she was not really personally involved, except of course that when he was in trouble politically.
Trouble came suddenly, late in 1943. Argentina's civilian government was overthrown by a military junta, and the new rulers rounded up anyone considered a threat. Berman was arrested and jailed. For Isa, this was a dilemma with a familiar face. 20 years before, she had struggled to free Israel Heifetz from a Bolshevik cell. Now she and Berman's daughter Sylvia put their differences aside and filed endless appeals for Gregorio's release.
A fines de febrero lo liberaron. Habíamos hecho una cantidad de gestiones con Isa, habíamos visto a todo el mundo, inclusive lo habíamos entrevistado a Perón.
At the time, Juan Perón was a junior member of the ruling junta. It was not the last time the ambitious young officer would play a central role in the life of Isa and Gregorio. In July 1944, Isa sang in Carnegie Hall for the first time in 4 years. Enthusiastic crowds came to see this comeback concert, but more than 2 decades after her triumphant debut, the novelty was gone. Some reviewers seemed politely puzzled by her act. One called her a vocal mime. But tepid reviews were the very least of Isa's worries. Already in 1944, rumors were filtering through the Jewish community that unspeakable things were happening to the Jews under the Nazi occupation. By the time the war ended a year later, there was no escaping the truth of the Holocaust. Isa had been safe in Argentina or New York during the war. Now, like Jews around the world, she had to come to terms with the destruction of her people.
It was a dreadful period for her because she lost all her friends. At least she thought she had lost all her friends, but a few of them turned up. But most of them were gone, including my father, of course.
Israel Heifetz, who had lifted Isa from the village and launched her on her voyage to fame and success, had been among the first taken. As Isa discovered, her first husband had been arrested on their daughter's wedding day.
She went back immediately after the war was over, and his landlady told her that the Germans had come to take him away the day that they came into Paris on the 14th of June. And he died in Breendonk, a concentration camp in Belgium.
Suddenly, Isa and thousands like her were relics from a vanished world. The Yiddish world of the Pale of Settlement was gone. The tattered remains of Europe's Jews straggled to America, to England, to Palestine. Their poetry and history were ashes. Their songs and stories were buried in the mass graves. The world that had given birth to Iza Kремер had disappeared. Now, whenever Isa sang her Yiddish songs, she would be calling forth the echoes of a lost civilization. For Izа Kремер, the end of the Second World War meant freedom. She could travel once again to the old cities and resume a semblance of her former life. But now, Isa's concerts had taken on a deeper and more solemn meaning. When she sang in Yiddish before the war, Izа had been singing the songs of a complex and thriving culture. Now, Izа had outlived that culture. In every concert, she would be singing for those whose voices had been silenced. In 1946, she traveled to Palestine and sang benefit concerts for Jewish groups trying to found a Jewish homeland there. In 1948, the State of Israel became a reality.
And they became very chauvinistic. She went to sing in both in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem. At that point, they were very militant, about not speaking Yiddish. They said, oh, you can't sing here in Yiddish. You can only sing here in Hebrew.
Once again, Jews were asking Izа not to sing in the Jewish language. This time, it was for different reasons. The Zionists had rejected Yiddish as a language of exile and had resurrected Hebrew as the daily language of Israel.
And she said, I sang Yiddish in front of the brown shirts in Germany, and if I could do that, I can certainly sing Yiddish in Israel. Yiddish is part of my repertoire, and if I don't sing in Yiddish, I don't sing. So they made an exception, and she sang in Yiddish.
Izа was back on the stage. Her concerts were few. She was now over 60, but she could still fill a concert hall in Paris or London.
June 26, 1951, Paris. My darling, my love, the concert was marvelous. I was in perfect form. It has been a wonderful season for me. I have left many good friends and a most enthusiastic public to come back to. Your Izа.
Whenever possible, she traveled to New Jersey, where her daughter Tusia was raising a family.
My perception of Izа as I was growing up was of this fabulous, flamboyant, wonderful, gorgeous woman. And she was my grandmother. There was this beautiful portrait of her on the living room wall. She looks very exotic and very glamorous. And I would always bring my friends in to see, this is my grandmother. She was an international folk singer. She spoke 18 languages. She sang, it was a part of my life that it just gave me a little bit of glamour.
As she got older, Izа found her frequent separations from Berman more and more painful. Although Izа and Berman were never legally married in Argentina, she added his last name to her own. She remained engaged in his work, accepting the post of Minister of Culture in the Argentine-Soviet Friendship Society. But life in Argentina was about to become much more complicated. In 1946, General Juan Perón won the presidency in a civilian election. Leftists in Argentina eyed the new president, who had clear fascist leanings, with suspicion. The suspicion soon turned to shock. Perón and his wife Evita courted and won the allegiance of the working class, the very people who had given communist leaders like Berman whatever power they had.
All of this created a honeymoon which allowed Perón basically to go easy on opposition. After Evita died, things began to change considerably and the repressive atmosphere began to intensify. And it was precisely during the final years of Isa's life that the Peronist government dramatically increased the repression against all quarters, against intellectuals by purging the universities, against artists by intensifying the blacklisting of actors, singers.
Izа, as the wife of one of Argentina's leading communists, was blacklisted from performing in any of the important concert halls in Argentina. In the spring of 1956, Izа complained to Gregorio about digestive problems. Gregorio gave her a quick examination and discovered a tumor in her stomach. Berman would later write to a friend that he rushed Izа to specialists in Buenos Aires. The doctors operated, but they could offer no real hope.
Stoically, she suffered for some weeks. When the pain and suffering became unbearable, the doctors told her that they were going to submerge her in sleep, and she would wake up cured. My precious companion died the 7th of July in the morning.
I realized that she had a very hard life. I mean, she had a wonderful time because she was a naturally extremely bouncy, happy person, but she had a very hard life.
In 1956, there was no Jewish cemetery in Cordoba. Isa was buried in a graveyard for non-Catholics known simply as the Dissidents Cemetery. But politics pursued Isa even in the grave. In 1976, a repressive military regime once again took over Argentina. No territory was off limits for its paramilitary thugs. Even gravestones of long-dead enemies were defiled. Isa's gravestone was destroyed. Her precise resting place is no longer known. Behrman donated Isa's collected papers to a Jewish historical society in Buenos Aires. In 1992, a terrorist bomb destroyed the Jewish Community Center, taking half the archives with it. By pure chance, Isa's records survived. Isa Kremer sang, and the world crumbled around her. She traveled through the most turbulent period in human history and lived to sing about it.
She moved from culture to culture, relationship through relationship. She carried something of everything with her, and everything was a part of her. She stands for the survivor in the midst of the rubble.
She was the creation of a civilization that vanished in her own lifetime. It was the source of her inspiration and her gift. By the end of her life, that gift had brought with it a sorrowful burden. To Isa was left the task of mourning the vanished world in song. The savagery of the Holocaust has become one of the defining events of modern history. But Isa's songs, the humble songs of kitchen and cradle that she had brought to the stage, reached past the horror to summon up the bittersweet life of the lost culture itself. Throughout her own long and extraordinary life, Isa maintained the courage and optimism that the Yiddish world had bestowed upon her. In the end, when she saw her own death approaching, she wrote to her daughter, Tusia, to pass on her last gift.
And she said, I don't want you to be sad because I have had a wonderful life, and to everything there must come an end. And it was really an amazing letter. I mean, it was a letter that was so completely Isa. You know, it was full of a feeling of this is life, and she was up, and everything was all right.
lieb.